So, hello everyone, and welcome to our talk on enterprise knowledge graphs. This is a panel discussion in that sense that we will not be doing individual presentations or anything like that. It's going to be 2 hours of full discussion and our talking heads here on the screen. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. For the audience that is now joining us so slowly, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, in the chat here on the right below. We will take them as we proceed. I will make note of them, ask them out loud, or maybe some of the panelists will also be writing their answers directly in the chat. And then we're going to have a few questions for our panelists. And if you feel like you want to answer that question as well, because maybe you have some experience in enterprise knowledge graphs and some of your own experience, feel free to do that as well. We're happy to see other answers also in the chat, and maybe we can pick up on them and make this a little bit interactive. In the previous discussion, I was actually pulled to, like, somebody noticed that from the chat that I was asking something. So I was given audio even to talk. I'm not sure if we're going to get to that in this session, but definitely we want to hear from you, at least in the chat. And that's all. Let's go to the introduction of our panelists today. We have Ashleigh Faith here, who has over 15 years of applied experience in the corporate world, to mention some: NASA, NATO, and John Deere. And she's sporting her own YouTube channel, making knowledge graphs understandable as well as looking fabulous. And I'm happy to share with you in the chat her YouTube channel as well as LinkedIn profile. So hopefully you can see a little bit more what Ashleigh's been up to. And then we have, let me just put that link in here, and then we have Mike Atkin. Mike has over 30 years of experience as a strategic analyst to financial institutions. He's the former director of the Enterprise Knowledge Graph Foundation and now managing director of content strategies. He supports a treasure trove of arguments and experiences of companies succeeding with the data with the use of the W3C stack of the semantic web. And let me just post you Mike's LinkedIn profile, so you know who we're talking about also in the virtual realm. And then we have Michael Uschold. I have the pleasure to meet him for the first time myself. If this whole conference would be an offline conference, I would see each other in person, and my copy of A Demystifying OWL for the Enterprise would be an actual book, a hard copy, and not my Kindle one. And I would ask Michael Uschold to sign that for me. Actually, I'm making my entire team of knowledge graph specialists and knowledge modelers who are new to knowledge graphs and connected data. I make them read his book, and it's like at the top of our curriculum list. So welcome, Michael, welcome, Ashleigh, welcome, Mike. And let's going to start this whole panel discussion with the first question. And Ashleigh, you're first to answer this. The others have a little bit more time to think about it. But what is your elevator pitch for an enterprise knowledge graph? Go.
So I am sure the Mikes and Katariina also have some great pitches. But one thing that I have found always helps when you're doing the elevator pitch is not necessarily talking about why we're so passionate about graph and why it's going to do, wonderful things, for certain use cases. That's going to come. But what I have always found helpful is you get one of the most important queries for your business, and you have to make sure that it has over more than 3 joins. Okay, so it's a complex query. And then you do that exact same query with a knowledge graph. And you calculate how much time and effort it takes to do both. And you can clearly see that knowledge graph for highly complex related data is actually more effective. You always want to make sure you set expectations. It's not instantaneous that you're going to achieve those efficiencies. But that has always opened up the eyes of people that are like, well, yeah, you can do that in a regular relational database. Well, yeah, but it's going to take you a lot more effort. So that's usually how I go about it.
Thank you. And the next, Mike, what's your elevator pitch for knowledge?
So I do it kind of from a business perspective, and I try to make the business case in short, right? So we're all familiar with the reality of silos. They exist across our enterprise for lots of reasons, and for the most part, they're based on old technology that is rigid and inflexible. And there are two big problems that stem from what I call this fragmented technology environment. The first is that data is incongruent, like doesn't match across repositories. And the second, that it impedes innovation and stifles development. I make the further case that those technology problems are a serious liability, right? They add cost and complexity to our operations. They divert resources away from our business goals. They lead to frustration by business stakeholders, and they lead to more regulatory oversight challenges. The good news is that those problems can be solved, right? The payoff is significant and the value is sustainable. The pathway, and I don't talk about knowledge graph at all, the pathway is to adopt data standards, right? And those are standards that were created by the US Department of Defense specifically to handle interconnected data coming at us faster in a wider variety of formats. So I guarantee you at the end of our standards journey, our firm can save at least 30% off operations right off the top. We can link and automate systems. We can give business the ability to handle, to be more innovative, and we can get a positive nod from our regulators. And I guess, and finally, Katariina, with a little bit of investment and the right air cover, we can deliver that first use case in 90 days or less.
Thank you. I was especially hooked on the fact that this is Army technology, as you're saying.
Actually, the history is really awesome when you think about how it was created.
Yeah,
that's
what a wonderful hook for someone. It's like, wait, I want that, right? And Michael, finally, what's your elevator pitch for enterprise knowledge graphs?
Hi, well, thank you, everyone, and Katariina. So I focus, like Mike does, on silos. And so any organization suffers from the problem. People want to get information, but in order to get an answer to a question, they need to search multiple databases. And so how do you get the information from multiple databases? Maybe you're an expert in one of them, but you're not an expert in the others. So you have to find other people, and they run the queries, and they send you the CSVs, and then you spend half your life munging around in pivot tables and Excel, and finally you get your answer. So maybe you ask the question and 2 weeks later you get an answer because everything is in a silo. So the question is, why is everything in a silo? And there's really 4 core reasons, and they relate to traditional technology of relational databases. So 1, there's no global identifiers that you can use that are respected across multiple databases. Now, people in organizations often create and use consistency and identifiers, but the database technology does not support it. Another thing that's not supported is the reusing of a data model. So if you have several different parts of the organization which have overlapping information, they're each going to create their own data models. And even if they wanted to share them, and even if they created data models that mean exactly the same thing and used exactly the same terminology, there's no way to import a data model from one system to another. Thirdly, there's not very much support for representing what things mean. So when you try to reuse a database or a data model, you don't even know what was intended. In the good old days, people talked about conceptual models and then logical models and then physical models, and the conceptual models where the meaning resided. But those are left by the wayside and they never really live on. So you left a situation where people don't know where things mean. And finally, Mike commented on rigidity. Once you get down to the physical model, the reason they optimize for certain types of queries. So if you want to ask a different type of a query, you're in trouble. So knowledge graphs are using different technology with using RDF, and you have the global RIs that addresses all those problems. So that means you can take information from multiple databases, put it all in triples, and ask questions and in the manner that Ashleigh hinted at a few minutes ago. So that's my quick pitch.
Yes, and really to combine all these different pitches, and it's about identity and meaning and the means to express both.
Yep.
And this technology has been around, at least the W3C stack has been around for some time now, for over, like, say 20 years now, approximately. It depends on where you count it, but it's been around for some time. So the question I would like to next express to you is, why now? Why enterprise knowledge graphs now? Why are they popular now? Why didn't we, like, why wasn't this happening already 20 years ago or even 10 years ago?
I'll take a page from Mike's book, actually, because I was talking to some of the big aerospace manufacturers about this about 5 years ago. And the answer they gave me was it's compute power. It's really come a long way. That's certainly not the only reason, but that's a big reason. As you mentioned, ontologies, RDF, these standards have all been around for quite some time. Logically, they even existed before we were talking about it from a computer standpoint. But the processing power just wasn't there. And now that it is there, and it's a lot less expensive than it used to be, it's really bringing this into reality, because it's always big data that we're talking about with these.
It's kind of funny, actually, to build off of that. Up until now, we tend to operate in our process silo as well, right? And we can make things work in this vertical way, and we always have been able to make it work. And now the world is just more complicated and interconnected. We're trying to make things go this way, and we wind up, spending a lot of time doing what I call data janitorial work. And, it's like 70% of expensive analyst time are spent reformatting and locking down meaning and doing transformation. And, it's like, that's a big waste of energy, right? Not only that, but I think I heard some statistic the other day. It was 20%, less than 20% of the data in your organization is new, right? Everything else is copies and copies of copies. And we have this expensive death march of data cleansing, manipulation, and transformation just to make the software work, right? So if you put all that together, right, the data has been tortured to death, transformed and renamed. It's not available when we need it. It's stuck in these rigid schemas. It's not traceable as we're trying to produce, our audits and verify its flow. It's not testable as fit for purpose. And it's possible to fix all this stuff. Oh, by the way, using standards, so it's not locking yourself into some vendor's proprietary technology. And it's not a huge investment, right? It's not a technology spend, right? This is a cultural orientation approach problem rather than a technology spend. So when you put all that together, I think it's the moment of understanding how do we get flexibility of the usage of our data.
Such a evocative terminology, Mike.
Say again.
Yeah, just going to comment on the answer to the question, why all this interest in enterprise knowledge graphs at this particular time? And as Ashleigh mentioned, the technology has been around for a long time. And as Mike and I have both been talking about, the problems of silos have been around for decades upon decades. So why now? And yes, Ashleigh's correct. There is a certain definite part about performance. For the longest time, the relation database was the only one that could perform at giant scale. But now that's shifting in the last say 5 years. But I think another part of the answer is, like many things, things build up. There's lots and lots of buildup of energy and potential. And then so how did it all happen? Well, gradually, and then suddenly, a bit like an earthquake. So slowly, people are realizing, and then suddenly the word gets out. And so all kinds of books are being written. More and more people have the required technical competence. For just one comment, I was kind of staggered. A few weeks ago, I checked in with my publisher to ask how sales were going. And he gave me a number, and I was like, really? Are you kidding me? So for the first 3 years, I sold so many books. And then for the first 9 months of this year, I sold more than the total amount for the previous 3 years. So that means it's a factor of 3 increase just in 2021. That kind of stupefied me. But I guess in a way, I'm not that surprised because there's so many other books coming out with knowledge graphs and everything else. So it's kind of like this has been going on for a long time, and technology is maturing. More and more people have the required technical competence, and the time is now.
You know, it's a really good point, Mike. People do not know where to go to get trained on how to adjust from, relational world to an RDF world. And it's really the advent of books like yours and Deb's and Dean's and others that are coming out that are kind of giving people the tools they need to make that transition.
Exactly right.
Well, I think it's mainstream too, right? Like, I can't remember the exact date that the Google Knowledge Graph, they had this great little, Mona Lisa thing that they had, you saw it everywhere. And it just became a thing that people interacted with. They had no idea what a knowledge graph was, but they knew it was useful. And it kind of just grew from there, I think, from the regular public perspective.
Go ahead, Mike.
Please.
Thank you. The notion of mainstream is an interesting one. Juan Cicada announced a couple years ago, I don't know, maybe you saw that announcement. He said, hey, yes, knowledge graphs and whatnot are mainstream. Want to bet? And it kicked off a discussion. There's different senses of mainstream in the sense that these days, pretty much every organization that we get into or we talk about, somebody somewhere in the organization has an ontologist, or they're building a knowledge graph, or they're doing some kind of experimenting. Almost everywhere we go now, somebody's already doing something, sometimes multiple projects. Whereas even 3-4 years ago, we were often just the first company in there, right? So there's a lot going on now.
It's still stuck in the innovation lab. However, we should be a little bit grounded in reality. This is not yet mainstream as we all hope it is, but there are lots of experiments that are going on, and people are beginning to operationalize those experiments. We're kind of standing at that growth curve, so I'd say hopeful opposed to.
There's levels of mainstream. There's in one sense, and Juan is correct. In pretty much every organization, somebody's doing it. So at that level, it's kind of mainstream. It's not just 1 or 2 organizations doing anything. But the sense in which it's not mainstream at all is to say, well, most organizations, most people, most of the time are using knowledge graphs. That's not the case at all. Relational database is still far and away the most popular thing. So that will take time. And maybe when things settle out in 5 or 10 or 20 years, there will always be a role for relational database. Maybe that'll be 20%, and NoSQL will be 20%, and knowledge graphs will be the rest of it. That's anybody's guess.
Yeah, it's really, I guess it boils down to the maturing of time and the maturing of tools, as well as the maturing of know-how, as to summarize basically what you're saying. We have a few questions from the audience. I think we need to work a little bit on our definition for knowledge graph. There's a question of, is it strictly RDF database that can be labeled as a knowledge graph, or labeled property graph also falls under this category? There seems to be a theme throughout. We already had it in our previous discussion, I think last week or a week before, with that we were together on with Ashleigh. Just to clarify, RDF or an RDF database called a triple store is a format of how to store graph data, and labeled property graph is another format, another morphology for that kind of graph database. Knowledge graph is a more abstract thing. It's a practice. It's like an infrastructure project especially in the enterprise. It's an infrastructure project. It means a little bit more than just the database that's being used. And there might be even like a challenge to knowledge graph terminology itself, because it ultimately is something that Google coined in 2012 which Ashleigh referred to that Mona Lisa video. They were saying that they have these strings that are actually things, and then they coined this term knowledge graph for that product. Then we have this.
Oh, hang on. Let's not move too quickly over that, because
for that question, any comments?
It's a really important point. Knowledge graph is a marketing term, and it's filled with hype. I know we're going to talk about that a little later, but Mike Uschold, I think, started to really identify the two key things, right? It's identity resolution and meaning resolution, expressed in a standard way using W3C standards that can also be combined with business rules. And if you look at those three big problems, right? Identity, meaning, and rules, right? That's data management right there. And knowledge graph addresses those problems. And, getting into holy wars about whether property graph or knowledge graph, I think they're going to come together anyway. But we should really talk about the problem, right? The problem is identifiers everywhere, all have been adjusted and modified for their various circumstance, and then data transformed to match data models, to feed software, to drive applications. We know the problem. Knowledge graph is a solution to the problem. And that's, I think, is what makes it most exciting.
Yeah, I would tack on. Oh, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
No, all right, sorry. We both spoke about the same moment. So I think it's an extremely important question, and everyone is interested in that. What's the difference between labeled property graphs and RDF graphs, and does it matter? And should you call one a knowledge graph or shouldn't you? I agree with Mike, it's a bit moot what you call things, but it is important to know what you're talking about when you're talking to a given person. So the way I think about it is, you think about this four hierarchy: data, information, knowledge, wisdom, right? So what does the knowledge mean? Knowledge means you understand what's going on. So a labeled property graph and an RDF graph both represent data. Does it represent information? Sure, why not? What I think about when it's knowledge, it's when it's backed up by some kind of schema, because then you know what the data is referring to. Now you have kind of implicit schema in labeled property graphs in that you name things and you kind of have a notion of a class and you have names of properties. But labeled property graphs give limited ability to represent schema information, although I believe that's changing. Whereas with RDF, you have all to represent the schema information. So I would never want to say to someone who has a labeled property graph and they're doing everything just hunky-dory, I wouldn't want to say, that's not a knowledge graph. I might say, are you representing the schema information? Can you run inference? And they might say yes or no. But that doesn't mean it is or isn't a knowledge graph. It just means that's what they have. And again, Mike says we shouldn't get boiled down too much in technology. We should understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
So I take a little bit different of approach to all of this. I don't define a knowledge graph that way at all. In fact, I don't think you need technology to have a knowledge graph. Knowledge graph is just a logical representation of the knowledge that you have. So let's take the risk assessment that Mike was alluding to earlier with supply chain. If you don't know where your supplies are coming from, you could get bottlenecks, or there are standards and regulations associated with building and parts. If you don't know what standards you have to adhere to, you could be in some legal trouble. That's a human logic understanding of something. If you look at a part, you're not going to know that there's a regulation associated with it. When you add that knowledge associated with that class, this nut, right, that's going to go into my aircraft, it has these 5 standards, and these sections from those standards I have to adhere to for regulations. Oh, and if I don't, here are the risks. So you can do risk assessment with it. That is a knowledge graph. Notice I didn't talk about knowledge graph databases. I didn't talk about a schema. That's what a knowledge graph is. And thank you to Aura, because he's the one I talked to about that and helped me understand it better.
Well, I was actually in the previous, listening to the previous talk where Aura was talking about it as well. And he was, I mean, we know that Amazon Web Services is already putting some efforts. They have this 1G approach, one graph approach. They want to, at some point, be able to combine really RDF and an LPG world. But I agree. I mean, for this talk, let's keep it at the enterprise level. Let's keep it at the purpose level of it, and what we need, and trust that the technology is there and the tools are there, and then your engineers and whoever you put into you hire for building that will be able to build it using all this huge variety actually that is out there. And I want to take one step back from the knowledge graph as a solution for an enterprise's data problem, because it's not that companies are now solving data problems. They have been solving data problems for some time, right? We have enterprises investing in data traditionally, such as through employing data catalogs, master data management projects. I used to work for a German company. Master data management projects are big in Germany. Data mesh. These are, there's like a lot of methods for managing the madness of dysfunctional, chaotic data, where problems are addressed that we have identified here, such as data cannot be found, or it cannot be connected to each other, or it takes too much time, something is lost, it cannot be reused. So now we come in with our fantastic enterprise knowledge graph and tell these companies that, hey, all of that you could solve with an enterprise knowledge graph. And they've already done a lot of the data work, and they call themselves data-driven. So when you find a company in that situation, how do you convince them that they need to invest a little bit more and that they need to invest exactly in enterprise knowledge graphs? I was thinking that maybe, Ashleigh, since you had a masterclass on this in the Connected Data London last time on retaining and recovering context for machine learning using taxonomies and knowledge graphs, I was wondering if you would want to start first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, whichever one you're using, whatever things that are building out that solution, you have to have a common understanding. Oftentimes that comes with a control vocabulary. And if you don't have one, look around. I'm sure you do have one. You just aren't talking to the people at your organization that have it. And once you have that common understanding, I think that's the first step in the enterprise knowledge graph journey, actually.
Yeah, Ashleigh, I think you're really spot on, and let's not conflate these two things, right? So traditional data management, and I'm going to call it data hygiene. It's essential. You must do that regardless of how you implement it, right? We have to do inventory and systems of record and lineage of the data flows, identifiers and glossaries, metadata. We have to do all that stuff, right? And the first issue is doing that alone does not solve the problem of silos and structural rigidity. It's hard to do. So if you're going to do it, be strategic about it and plan for using it and reusability and leverage across your enterprise, because our goal is to turn data as a problem to manage into data as a resource to exploit. So, and you still need to do that in your semantic world, right? So all the work that you've done in your traditional data management program is leverageable. It's all needed it's only about how do you implement, right? And we're implementing it with identification standards and meaning standards.
Michael, what do you think?
Well, nothing more to add at the moment. We'll carry on the conversation as we go.
Well, yes, and if I may just not be the only moderator, but I have a few thoughts as well about this, and kind of listening to what we were discussing also previously about this need for meaning and expressing meaning, and putting together also what one from the audience was saying, that Adam was saying, what I found great with the Google video was that it resonated with me as a normal person. It was humanistic and relatable for our business stakeholders. It was communicated more as an idea than a digital solution. And I think if we think about this question that, yes, companies have invested before in data solutions. But what differentiates a knowledge graph from these solutions is that for the first time it's saying there needs to be a human-computer interaction happening on a data level. Mm-hmm. The human understanding, the know-how, that implicit thing, which also at IKEA we call the magic of IKEA, or that warmth that we have in IKEA. And now that IKEA is also investing in knowledge graphs, we need to find ways in which we can express that. And no data catalog, data mesh, single solution, or any database really does that, because they're just application and solutions. We need something, we need that infrastructure to have the human voice, human understanding, human meaning, context as part of this this data work that the company.
There's a simpler way of thinking about it as well, right? There's what I call a prime directive for data management, and a prime directive is simply to deliver to business users data they have trust and confidence in to be exactly what they expect and true to origin, without reconciliation, without manual transformation. And the simple truth is, we don't do that. We haven't achieved that objective, that prime goal of data management. We are not delivering yet. So all that great hygiene is terrific and important, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? So this solves the problem, and that's a good add-on to kind of why we're doing this.
Well, I think there's different use cases for an enterprise knowledge graph too. So Mike, you're talking about a very specific use case that kind of does trickle through a lot of other things at the enterprise, but like the type of knowledge graph I work on is for search, which you're trying to manage your data so you can find it, right? But if you're not describing the information in a way that your actual users are going to resonate with, to Katariina's point, you're not doing it right, right? So I find this all the time with people and that's where the control vocabulary comment comes from, is if you go out and you look at what does NASA use to describe these things, but you're working at Boeing, they might not be using the same terminology. So if you're using that in your knowledge graph to expand search, for instance, that gets you farther in bridging the gap between the official terminology for something and the terminology your actual users are going to use. I talk about this all the time. It's your natural language, that when you're like, oh, what's the name of that thing? When you're doing that, you're going back to your mental model that you grew up with. And that is created between the ages of 3 and 9. And that's the people around you, the culture, the language you're speaking. That's what you go back to when you don't know what you're looking for. We all do it when we use Google. And it's funny because enterprise knowledge graphs are now a way for us to take in that Google-like search and actually make it work for our users. I think that's a big adoption piece for it.
Absolutely. It's kind of funny because it's about meaning, not words. And we use nomenclature to describe the column names of the things that are in our relational database. And, I see 25 different column names for customer, and then we acquire another company, they got a different 25, and we're trying to reconcile, and really it's a real thing. And if we just recognize that what we are describing by our data is a representation of a real thing, and who cares what you call it, we care exactly what it is. And we can now do that, right? We can express meaning as opposed to just using labels.
That's the beauty of UIDs. They're just an ID. You can put whatever label you want on it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's the point about terminology is a very interesting one, and use cases that Ashleigh mentioned. So in the case of semantic search, it's extremely important to worry about the words. As Mike said, if you're not doing in a semantic search context, you're really just doing database lookup, then the words initially point you to the concepts. So people talk about, we had an interesting example for risk in a large financial organization. We had a dozen people in the room, and each one had their own way of thinking about risk. And they tried for 3 hours to come up with a single definition that matched how they think about risk. And they thought they got there. One person said, so I think it's blah, 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 blah. And the other person said, yeah, that's right. And then they gave their pitch on it, and that was actually different. They weren't even saying the same thing, right? So what actually happens in this type of a situation is everybody's thinking about the same bundle of concepts, but from a different way, from a different perspective. So in that case, I said, well, wait a minute, it was very frustrating, but we can't all agree on what risk is, but can we agree on what we're talking about when we talk about risk? It's some bundle of concepts. So in four-year-old terminology, there's a bad thing that might happen. There's some degree of likelihood of it happening. There's a measure of how bad it is. And then there's measures you put in place to make it less likely to happen. And I said, when we're talking about risk, isn't it really that exactly what we're talking about? And after 3 hours of arguing and nobody agreeing on what risk is, everybody could at least agree that when we're talking about risk, we're talking about that kind of bundle of concepts. So that often is the case. It even arises in the question of knowledge graph. So Ashleigh has a view of knowledge graph, property graph people have a view. And they're talking about the same idea, but from a different perspective. So terminology is very important. The way we think about it is kind of like what Mike was saying. Initially, you have words. You hear people use words in the organization. They talk about risk. They talk about process. They talk about customer. They talk about product. But then you realize, well, they're actually talking about different things. Let's tease out what they're really talking about. And then say, okay, now we have the nuanced differences between the different concepts. So now let's think of some good names that make it easy to remember. The names aren't important at one level from the machine processing, but they are important for the people to communicate. What did you mean when you said risk? Oh, I meant the probability of expected nature, or I meant some other definition. So terms are really important. They point to the concept and you nail down the concept, and then you back up and say, well, the word risk is too general, it's too ambiguous, it's guaranteed to confuse people. Let's think of something more specific, like process risk or expected value or something like that. So the terms is quite important.
So Mike, just a real quick story to build off of that. So this is a few years ago, the U.S. Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board was trying to promote a transparency of muni bonds. And they asked the depository to do this big re-engineering project. And 2 years later, they come out with this big, complicated schema. And no one could map to it. So we got the whole industry together. And I was a facilitator of this meeting, just trying to determine what does it mean to have a municipal bond? What are the required data attributes? And you had front office and back office together. And everybody realized that if you change the words, you're going to change my database structure. And that is prohibitively expensive. I don't want to do it. And literally, we were this close to fistfights. And after frustration, I said, do we at least agree on what these things are?
Exactly. And it's
everybody in like 1 hour said, absolutely, we know what they are because they're all pros. So that's why modeling is so important, right? You capture the concept. Who cares what you call it, as long as you understand what the thing is.
That's the most important thing for sure.
So this leads to me to a question that is actually, since the difficulty of the point of a knowledge graph, and actually this is like an ontology definition, which is the technology, the W3C stack technology behind the schema definition language behind knowledge graphs. So the definition of ontology is explicit, shared conceptualization, shared understanding. So Mike, you were mentioning fist fights. Is it possible to get an enterprise to agree on an explicit shared conceptualization?
Well, first recognize, at least in my observation, just in the financial industry, there are only 4 types of data. There is reference data, right? Which is factual. You can, an issuance document, that's verifiable. So that's determined by its facts. There is transaction data. That's really basically metadata. When did it occur? There is product and customer data, which is agreement, right? We have to agree what a gold customer is or what a high risk customer is. So you got to get agreement on that. And then there is what's now known as alternative data, which is process. How was it created and where did it come from? And if you divide the world up into things like that, it might be different in other worlds, then you can anchor your data to something. Sometimes you anchor it to precision. Sometimes you anchor it to consensus. But the whole goal of all of that is unambiguous shared meaning about the thing.
Well, I think that's where that virtualization comes in that I was just mentioning about, semantic search. I don't have to agree that Mike calls something kitty cat and I call it pussycat. It's the same conceptual thing. So as long as we can map those two things together, we can virtualize it into a concept that means the same thing. And so I deal with language the most in my knowledge graph, which is one of the hardest things to model, by the way, because and it's multilingual. People's mental models of things are different across the globe. And so there is no way I'm going to get everyone to agree. For instance, is it the Sea of Japan or the Korean Sea? Depending on who you talk to, one is right and one is wrong. But if I'm in Korea, I'm going to call it one thing. So being able to have that conceptual label, or that ID is usually what it is, and have that virtualized away from the data. Sales can have their own definition of a customer. Marketing can have its own definition of a customer for their use cases, as long as you can then conceptualize it into a model higher up that is abstracted for a specific use case where you would have an agreement on what is a customer, then you're okay.
Yep.
If I may add to that, actually, the great thing about knowledge graph is that, or the technology used for that, is that you can also define that this is the meaning for this group of people and this is the meaning for this group of people. For example, winter. I was working for fashion e-commerce before joining IKEA, and there we had this problem of disambiguating winter. Like customers were using winter in search, and it wasn't performing well because it wasn't really producing the right kind of products until we told the machine that, okay, winter means you need to look for warm lining and down filling and those kind of things. But we were mostly Nordic people working there, and we forgot about the Italian ladies who like to wear woolen mini skirts in the winter. That's like a Max Mara, the style you use in Italy, and nobody in the Nordics would even think about wearing a skirt for winter. But that was exactly that cultural difference that we needed to capture, and that we could capture because we were using a knowledge graph when we were saying, when you're in these countries, this is what winter means for that, and when you're in this country, this is what winter means. And I think that's the beauty of that as well, that there is a reason why we sometimes disagree with what the same concept means. It's because there is a difference, and even that can be then captured.
That's why you got to invest in business relationships and making sure that business defines what it is they want, not talk about technology or even data. Just make sure we understand what it is you want, and let's do that kind of modeling. That's the most important. That's where it all starts, I think.
That's the data therapist. I swear it needs to be a role in companies, because a lot of knowledge graph engineers, modelers, ontologists, that is kind of half of the job, right? Is getting people to talk about, how does this data make you feel? How is it treating you today? And then you have to figure out how to model that so people can use it and the computers can use it as well.
I'm writing that down, data therapist. I think that's brilliant. And I think this is a really nice bridge to the next part of our panel discussion, which is, okay, now I think we've come to some understanding of what we mean when we say enterprise knowledge graph. We also see that knowledge graph in itself is just a branding name, and there's more to it than just that word. We could build a whole entire knowledge graph describing what we mean with enterprise knowledge graph. As we said, terminology is important. So now we should be somewhat aware of what it is and what it does and what we mean. The question is, how does one get started with building a knowledge graph and in the enterprise context? Do you have, like we said, we wouldn't talk too much about technology, but if you have some ideas on the supporting technologies that help, that would be really good as well. Then there's things that a second thing to think about is how to staff the team. But let's get started. How can we get started on enterprise knowledge graphs?
As Juan Cato always says, don't boil the ocean, right?
The very first thing to start off with is, why am I doing this? Is it even the right solution? Do I have a specific problem in mind that I'm trying to solve? So in the case for our sweet spot for our company where we do consultancy, our sweet spot is what we talked about before, managing silos. But it's not just, not silos, all the time don't necessarily cause a problem. So we say to the customer, what questions do you struggle with getting answers to now? Those are where we want to start. It's a bit like Goldilocks. You don't want to answer the easy questions that you already can easily get answers from relational. You don't want to make something so difficult that it's going to take you a year and a half to get anywhere. You want to find that sweet spot. So what's the question that you find it difficult to get an answer to today? And that's where we would start.
I would start with cognition and leadership being the prerequisites before you do anything in terms of building a knowledge graph. And if you understand why there is a problem of incongruence and inflexibility, and you fully understand that, like really grok it, then you can see why this is a smart pathway, it's smart policy. And then leadership is required because this is an agent of change. You're trying to get people to do something different, and there's always pushback. And if you have those things, which include picking the right sponsor and navigating that organizational inertia challenge that exists, then you start by modeling business value. Let the business define what it needs, it does, its use cases, not data, just what does it do? I think both Ashleigh and Michael described that. And I think this is kind of a little bit of bugaboo, you've got to engineer it correctly at a foundational level, because that's the leverage from which you're building everything else. And that's kind of leading to your next question about skill sets. But I think it goes in that order.
Mike, it's funny, the way that you describe that is showing how there is not agreement against what things are called and how you find them. I have a video where I talk about how do you pitch a taxonomy, and that's exactly what I do. You literally get people in a room and you give them a very small taxonomy, no more than 10 terms, and you give them one thing and you say, describe this, but don't talk to each other. Guaranteed they're all going to have different tags. That
Nice.
shows stakeholders very quickly why you need to do exactly what you're talking about. It's not hard, and they get it very quickly.
That's interesting.
That's a very good tool. I mean, Ashleigh, if you have the link to that YouTube video, I think the audience
I'll find it while we're talking.
Yeah, I think the audience would appreciate that link, because I think we're all going to do that in our next.
Well, James is a taxonomist. I see. He says hire a taxonomist in the chat. He's probably going to get it.
Okay. We trust that James will find it.
Let's not forget that taxonomies were originated like back in ancient Greece. It's like a concept that's been around for a while.
Yes, and before that, the librarians, how to index everything and so on. So that brings us to the next part of this question, which is the staffing. How many ontologists? 100? Would that be enough? Or is it really just 1.5? How many engineers? Mike, you said you need to acknowledge the solid technology, the technology's base needs to be solid. How big of an engineering team does that mean? What are the roles and how many of them do you need?
I think we start with business analysts who talk to users that are able to translate business speak into data concepts. And that's really important. Then you talk about the architects and the engineers and the ontologists who then construct that in an appropriate, logical way. And then you need user interface people to help them get the data out. I don't think it's a huge number of people, but those are specific important roles that have to be present.
Yeah, that's certainly true. You absolutely need someone to translate business speak into, data speak.
It's really the
It's-
pipeline. Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, go ahead.
you used to talk about the data pipeline of going from source and then turn it into triples and then put it into ontology. That's also really difficult, right?
Yeah, that's true. What we're finding is so we do lots of projects with lots of companies and lots of different flavors of projects. And it used to be that we did all the ontology work. And we did a lot of the data, creating triples from data. And then what often happened is the companies, people would say, okay, you make the triples and show us how to do it, but then we're going to write our own code in Java because we always do everything in Java. So we might start with R2 RML, or we might start with Tarkle just to get things going, and they just take it over, right? So that's fine. So they have in-house expertise. And what's happening in recent 2 or 3 years, we're finding that there are ontologists on board, and some of them are quite good, and we don't really need to train them up. Some of them are kind of junior, and we do train them up, and we work side by side. I think if you just hire an ontologist out of the blue and say, here, go do this, you may get some success, but you need a variety of skills. So ontologists these days often are developers as well. So they know how to do Sparkle, they know how to do Tarkle, they know how to write code. I'm not a developer myself, and I think that these days that's a disadvantage to not have developer skills. So you want people who have developer skills, you want people who have ontology building skills, and also Sparkle and Shackle, the whole Scooby-Doo.
I think that's a really tall order.
It is.
So,
It is.
I mean, the way that I always go about it, and I've had to build up 3 different teams at this point in different organizations to build out knowledge graphs that went out to production and are in the market. So
Yeah.
I think that means something went right. And
Absolutely.
the way that we started it, now remember, these were semantic knowledge graphs, so that matters here, is we got the people that were already doing some form of metadata management. So Mike, you'll be happy to hear that, right? There were people that were managing the data somehow, and they were either taxonomists or librarians or somebody, analysts even that knew where the bodies were buried, basically. And we sat down with them and we first started to ask, what are the hardest problems you are asked to solve on a regular basis? That gives you your use case, and you want to make sure it's scoped appropriately, that you can get it done in a few months, just the modeling and prototyping. And you want to look at the data after that. I used to think that you want to look at the model first to kind of get that representation of the business, but I've been bit so many times by that because a lot of people think the data will support things and they think the data is like that, but it's not. So make sure you look at the data in question while you're also helping people model it. And you don't need anybody with engineering experience at that point. In fact, there's a lot of companies out there, like Enterprise Knowledge is a great example. They'll help you build this stuff, right? So if you don't have people in-house to help you, you can get others to help you if that's your problem. But you need to get in the buy-in of your IP first, and that's the stuff that I just mentioned. You have to do that part.
Yeah, Ashleigh, it's really, really important point, because I think you're also alluding to how do you map from one application to another to your ontology. And if you don't know the data and you don't know the application, it's hard to map that thing correctly. So that's where a lot of that obstacle shows up.
Or are they unique IDs, or are they just unique IDs to that database? I had that problem once.
Oh, exactly. Clarification, Ashley, when you say you're talking about semantic knowledge graph as opposed to other types of knowledge graph, what do you mean exactly when you say semantic?
Yeah, I always forget I'm talking to a bunch of people that actually know semantics in a lot of ways. So semantic from a linguistic perspective. So this person is related to another person, or cats are related to dogs in a certain way. So linguistically, semantics is what I'm talking about.
Okay.
But thank you for that, because that might have been lost.
Yeah.
My own experience on having built enterprise knowledge graphs now, in the past 5.5 years, starting my 4th knowledge graph project, is that if you want to serve this internally to application, especially a company that might even have like a microservice infrastructure for its applications, you basically go into the business of selling APIs. So you're selling these, or you can call them data products as well, but they're ultimately there's like a question, and then that is answered somehow. And you do that service layer on top of Sparkle queries because of performance issues that might be. And I'm coming from e-commerce, so that performance is key there. So my experience is that the staffing is actually quite developer heavy in order to create the infrastructure to serve the knowledge. And my experience is that it's even 80%, off the top of my head, 80% of the work, then 10% or maybe 15% of that work is understanding the data. So having data scientists working with the data, having those business analysts also saying what that means, interpreting it, giving it names. And then that little 5% there, 5 to 10% is the actual modeling. The modeling that we're talking about that you would then express in a framework like RDF.
Just remember, it's a marriage counseling problem. We have to like kind of get people to talk to each other.
Exactly. Exactly. And yes, I mean, that
or
even
Ashleigh's therapist. You know, we clearly need data therapists.
That's the tech team. And then you have the product management team doing exactly that, like even finding the right people, asking those questions, doing the stakeholder work. The stakeholder work is huge.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes. Do you need so many people who know RDF when it's actually this amount of
small
work?
Small teams necessary.
Yeah,
I think that's actually a really big lesson learned, not just from my own experience, from a lot of people I've talked to, is so many of these projects fall flat because you start to say, oh, now you need to know RDF and you need to know Sparkle and Shackle. And oh yeah, there's this thing called a labeled property graph and there's a whole thing called Cipher on that. Once you start throwing that at people, they get very scared. And you don't need to throw all that at people. In fact, I actually found a lot of people understood graph better when I just talked about Sparkle as an object-oriented programming. It's not very different than that. Like if you look at how JSON is formed, it's not that different than what we're talking about. So just giving them some exposure to it. And the analysts, right? Like the people that are using the output of whatever your graph is doing, they don't necessarily need to understand how the sausage is made. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
So now if we've given like the advice to how to get started, and we form some idea of what kind of team you would have and picking the right kind of use case, doing the marriage counseling. What roadblocks? And I mean, we mentioned already some, which is that Ashleigh, you mentioned that maybe gets too technical, too fast in the beginning when you're discussing this with the business. But are there other roadblocks that one should watch out for? Is there like a possibility that you lose credibility because you're promising this amazing, I mean, it sounds so amazing, the enterprise knowledge graph, all your data problems will be gone. Is it really so?
No, I think that we've talked about this before, and I think Mike was starting to say something too. It's setting those expectations. It's not, that's why I opened with my pitch, right? Like if you show the promise, but then you have to very, very clearly and very quickly say, and it's going to take so much time, but here's how it's going to offset the price and the time that we're going to put into this. And you have to show how it's actually going to be effective.
You know, Katariina, I did benchmarking for the industry a while ago with the Knowledge Graph conference folks, and the result of that was organizational concerns are the kind of the biggest roadblock, right? You know, it's how do you overcome inertia, navigate those skill gaps, deal with budget constraints, you have governance maturity for your data hygiene activities. You got no imperial, all of that activity I think is what we have to focus in on, because in my observation, what happens is you get sabotaged, right? The technology works. This is not that hard to do. It's just data, for goodness sakes. But being able to get people to buy in and avoid the, we're wedded to our existing approach. You are going to step on my political or turf toes. If you don't deal with that reality, I think you've got a big problem in hand. The other thing is we never talk about the other side of the business case. There is a cost, right? There's a transitional cost. There's a infrastructure cost. There's a mapping cost. There's this is not automatic, and you have to kind of be realistic with people. You get this problem, this value, this approach for this cost, and then it becomes just a straightforward, business decision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with with the turf war thing. I had made a note of that myself. You just there's a term that someone came across called an eel. There's always an eel in a given organization. That's the person who's working to undermine your efforts, right? And they're the ones who are often involved in some kind of turf. So if they're going to lose 7 of their employees because everything is way more efficient, then they don't want to know about it. This has been going on for years, but you have to be aware of that and watch out. Another roadblocks are, maybe a big one is unrealistic expectations. You just have to not promise the ocean and have to say, we're going to start here. Think in the big picture, having kind of long-term vision, but start small and say, in these 2-3 months, whatever, we're going to deliver this, and not promise the ocean. So that's a definite roadblock. And then finding a good place to start. Again, that Goldilocks zone. It can't be too easy because then it doesn't impress anybody. It can't be too hard because then you'll never get done. But the other thing is, if you just get started, even if you do exactly the right thing in a local context, if someone else in the organization, a different division, or maybe say a different division, they're doing something related, but you're not talking to them, they're going to build out a nice little solution, maybe where there's 30 to 50% overlap in the product hierarchy or the customer database or something. And now you've got 2 people building semantic solutions using semantic technology. And one of the main purposes of semantics was to avoid the need for silos. But now, ironically, you're creating multiple semantic technology-based silos instead of relational database silos. So that's something that is a definite roadblock to longer-term progress. So our mantra at Semantic Arts is think big, start small. So think big means we're going to eventually grow this across the enterprise or some major, divisions within the enterprise. So, for example, Boeing is so gigantic. The military side is very, very different from commercial. So we probably wouldn't try to bridge that. But you really want to think in terms of growing the enterprise ontology, having a shared common core, and then having people build off of that. We've had a lot of success with that approach, working with certain financial organizations over several year periods. There's another thing that can get in the way. We've seen this some of the time. It's not the biggest problem, but something to be aware of. We sometimes walk into an organization and they've already, without knowing an awful lot about what they're doing because they're just getting started, they've already picked a technology solution and they say, this is a solution we're going to use. And we walk in there and say, well, you could use that. It might not be the best one. So that's a bit of a roadblock. It can slow things down because it's not really the best fit. That happens occasionally. So those are some of the
I would add to that too. And I think a lot of companies tend to only look internal to solve those problems, and know that you can bootstrap stuff. There's a lot of data sets out there on Amazon Marketplace. I know data.world has something like that, where you can go and buy some data to get you started and kickstart what you're doing, because sometimes people can just wallow in their data. And those of us that like data don't mind wallowing in data, but that's a risk, right? Like, we need to get something out so the business can buy in and see what we're doing. And you don't always have to figure it out on your own. There's so many other people working in this space now. And yeah, they might still be just doing POCs and it might still be academic, but they've thought about these problems and you can learn from that. So I would say that's a big risk, that if you don't look outside your walls, you could be reinventing the wheel when you don't have to.
Yeah.
Many times I actually bump into these developer teams that are hearing about RDF for the first time, and they're like, oh yeah, we built this like terminology map or something like that. They've built something very similar. They've built it themselves. They created all the tech for it, and then I come and like, where there is a standard for expressing exactly what you're attempting to do here, and there's a community supporting you. There are these conferences that you can go to and find that information, connect with the people. My own roadblock that I'm recognizing is, I mean, this was attempted around the 2005 to 8, and at that time it was very hot. Also, when I was majoring in semantic web still in university, was linked open data cloud, an attempt to share the vocabulary, share this data that is already in some shareable format. But I think that hasn't really succeeded. And I think if Michael, you're saying that at Semantic Arts, you're starting slow, but you're building one big knowledge graph for the enterprise because that is what they need. Otherwise, you fall into the trap of having multiple semantic silos. However, there is, on the other hand, there is this need for modularity in the knowledge graphs to be like, can contain some of the parts, be like, this is how this domain is modeled from this point of view, and for this use case, and so on. So how do you practically work with that? How do you share different vocabularies? How do you set the right kind of boundaries so that it is understandable, but at the same time that is still shareable and it's not siloed?
Yeah, that's a tricky problem. So we have experience with one financial organization that we've been working with for several years now. And early on, maybe a year and a half in, we realized this is going to be a real issue, and they started up a governance committee. So the governance committee was in charge of maintaining and evolving what we're calling, their core ontology. And they very consciously wanted it to be light touch, because anytime you have a heavy-handed approach, people freak out and they say, no, I don't like this. So they wanted to keep it light touch and say, here's the common core. We recommend that you use it. If you don't want to use it, that's on you. But here's something that's shared and people can build on it. So it's a tricky process. That governance committee meets, I think they meet every month. I'm not working on those projects anymore, but we've got several people in that organization working on 3 or 4 different projects. And they're coordinating. That's one of the roadblocks for the longer term success, is failing to coordinate building these silos. With this particular organization, it's a giant, major financial organization. And we're just kind of building it out slowly but surely, making a difference bit by bit.
Yes, we've also come to that conclusion that even though we start small and a governance council feels a bit silly, we will need to add this, this ritual or this habit of showing the designs, communicating the designs to one central committee that makes sure it has not been done somewhere before and that you actually can reuse. But I think that still seems like something that in the future we need to enable this discovery of data, and I'm seeing that as in all the work I'm doing. I'm also doing a pro bono circular economy knowledge graph, and the whole area of sustainability. I mean, we had that talk in the previous session, is interesting because there seems to be a lot of ontologies on it already and a lot of data, but finding that data, discovering it, reusing it, it's almost like we need a GitHub for knowledge graphs. We need a GitHub for ontologies. And
well,
I think
there's BioPortal, right? So if you have something like BioPortal, that would help.
Yes, but it seems to be that's still very domain specific, right?
One thing that's important,
Yeah.
so BioPortal, most or all of those ontologies are based on one common core ontology, which is called Basic Formal Ontology, BFO. So that's a really important point. If you're going to share across different ontologies and different groups, if you have that common core, you're much better off. That common core was built kind of by philosophers, but also very focused on the scientific community, which is a moderate amount of academic, very applied academia. But so that's where that comes from. We have our own enterprise core ontology that is free and it's open source. It's called GIST, and it has your basic concepts that are easy for everyday people to understand: agreement, organization, place, measurement, unit of measure. Whereas in BFO, which is fine for its domain of science and academia, they have things like generically dependent, continuant. It's very difficult to get business people to understand that. So with all
most of what I use, go ahead.
Yeah, so we use our own GIST for all the ontologies, and that way, if everybody's using that common core, there's some amount of integration that happens for free. Go ahead, Ashleigh.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, maybe it's because of my use cases that I use Knowledge Graph for, but I use BioPortal for the SCOS and SCOS XL vocabularies, and those are all usually standard. They sometimes have some add-ons, but they're usually understood pretty easily.
Oh, that's good.
But so I mean, that's a point, though. It's all about your use case, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I didn't actually know that they had a lot of SCOS-based ontologies. So it's not directly connected to BFO. It's more just standalone.
Yeah, I mean, those are the ones that I'm working on. Okay. If you look up the EDA vocabulary on BioPortal, I helped work on that one.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I go.
That one is not. That one is not W3C OK though. That was more for a very specific use case. If anyone goes looking for it.
Right. Okay.
But it does highlight part of the problem, which is, and Michael, you were beginning to describe this. There are some foundational concepts that are required before you do anything, like in the financial industry, commitment, ownership, time, role, party. I mean, you have to define those, and that doesn't necessarily translate to immediate value, right? You have to, start with those basic concepts, and it would be great if we had the shared ontologies that gave you a kind of a lift up to get that thing underway.
Yep.
I know there was a question way back in the chat about like why, from the person's perspective, label property graphs are really hitting the limelight or something, I think they said, compared to RDF. And I think it fits in with what we're talking about here, and that is those standards. It's a very strange world. All of us here, at least that are talking on the screen, I believe all of you recognize the value of standards. However, there are a lot of people that I have talked to about standards at the enterprise level, and they feel like it is a hindrance. It's just going to slow them down. It's not. It doesn't fit their exact needs and all of these things. And I think that plus label property graphs just make a lot of sense for a typical engineer. It's very similar to what they already do. They just plug and play and they figure it out. Not discounting label property graphs, by the way. I use them too. But I think that's why they have a higher adoption, is you don't have to invest that much into that initial model and get it out there. You just got to put the nodes in and you plug the data in and it starts to look like something. You can't necessarily do that with RDF. So I've said this before. Kirk Kaggle had a LinkedIn conversation about this. And I said, I love RDF. I think there's a lot of promise with what we do with it. The inferencing, I mean, there's so much good about it. But I'm saying this to the audience too, we need to get better. It should be demystified and we should help people understand it better, get rid of those hurdles, because that's the reason I don't want to say a lot of people, but that's why a lot of people that are already doing label property graph don't really want to do RDF.
Katariina had a question earlier on about hype, and I think the problem, Ashleigh, we have is that there is a lot of hype, and we have not demystified knowledge graph, and we are not doing a very good job of selling it. And we talk about how it works because we're so involved in all of these concepts that are exciting to us, rather than kind of what it does and when am I going to get it and why should I do it. We talk about philosophical things like ontologies and inference capabilities and self-describing data and multiple versions. I mean, nobody cares about those things. I think one of our biggest challenges is we got to figure out how to communicate in a lexicon that matches the real world, not just a lexicon that matches our development world.
That's a good point.
Half of my conversations are translating my language into what an engineer or a stakeholder would understand. Data therapist.
Exactly.
I have to say that engineers, I ran into a different kind of like customer therapist role when I told a bunch of engineers that actually an ontology and then like populated a knowledge graph is really good to express exactly how the customer thinks without you ever having to talk to a customer. The ontologist will do that for you, and then you will have a machine readable format of how the customer thinks. And I just the sigh of relief there in that room was tangible. There's actually, I mean, Ashleigh, I was like the moment you said that you want to answer this question from the chat, there've been some really interesting questions in the chat. So maybe now we should take a little time to attempt to answer those. I see you've answered some, but there's one that I would like to get from William. And this is a very kind of practical question, but I really like it since we're here and we can perhaps help. So William is asking, I am aiming to build a federation of microdomain KG, one for HR department about organization people, one for facilities, one for IT departments, and combine all into a master KG provision, a single point of access. Do you think, one, it is a good idea, two, it is doable? And Ashleigh, you answered already, referring to David Mesa's example in NASA. He was with Neo4j building a knowledge graph around the personal in order to know the skills of everyone and be able to connect skills with projects. I'm thinking, Mike or Michael, do you have some examples and some answer to this question from William?
I don't know how you do it without an ontology, however.
Mike,
I mean, if you're going to try to link up the human resources between technology and, HR and, you have to start with your ontology because that's, kind of defining meaning.
Yeah, I would say,
right?
I would say to William, that's very doable. And one of the reasons it's doable is because the information there, if I understand you, you want HR, I'm just looking at your question, HR organizations, IT departments, it sounds like master data kind of reference data, and it's the ontology to back it up is going to be relatively straightforward. So I think that problem is very doable. Start with a simple ontology of organizations and people and whatnot, and that's very doable. And probably it is a good, well, that's an interesting question. Yes, it's doable. Is it a good idea? That depends on what you need. How will that help you? It's a good idea if you already know that will help you, but if you're not clear on why it would help you, then it may not be the right thing to do.
Yeah, and just going back to the security and who's going to have access to it, how are they going to use the data? When you're dealing with people, you have to be extra cautious with the information that you're using because somebody, if they get into the wrong hands, it can be used very badly. People can be offended or hurt. I mean, there's a lot of things you have to keep in mind ethically when you do stuff with people.
And if you're in the EU legally with the GDPR law, do you have to be, it's like the most sensitive data. It's like a very big thing in the EU to keep personal information in good hands. And we
have one for California now too, I guess. in the US.
Isn't that one of the advantages of doing semantic technology, which is you can do data point authorization and protect entitlements? That's one of the value propositions of the whole thing, right?
Yes.
Mhm,
It is.
mhm.
A lot of the triple stores and things don't have security stuff baked in. It's something that people are realizing is very important. Now, if you go to AWS, they have what's it called, HIPAA compliance. So there's lots of stuff that's out there, but that's certainly a concern. We haven't had to worry about that too much. A lot of what we do is behind corporate firewalls, and so if a company has their financial transactions and their investments and whatever, that doesn't, they have their own security that they worry about. So
But it's very similar to the first application at the Department of Defense, which was try to harmonize Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard, human resources, right? What are soldiers called, or skill sets, capabilities, authorizations, that's,
Right.
perfect illustration of the value of knowledge graph.
I not to plug another of my videos, but I actually talked to the Navy about they have, well, and this is not classified, hence why it's on YouTube. But they were trying to figure out how to understand what was changing between a bunch of flight manuals, and they still. So, Mike, to your point, they're doing a lot of that. They were some of the very front runners to the stuff we're talking about, and yet they're very big organizations. So there's a whole lot of mess still. So their problem was we were trying to develop an ontology to actually take certain sections of the flight manuals that would have to get reprinted constantly and identify those in a knowledge graph so that they could just be swapped out in the PDFs. So, I mean, like, you can do all kinds of cool stuff with knowledge graphs.
It's kind of funny. We're talking use cases. I think we're all describing the inventory use case value, right? And if you build that first knowledge graph on what exists, what it's for, who's responsible, what the requirements are, how it flows, that's the foundation for all data management anyway. So build your knowledge graph on your inventory, and that's a great place to start.
Michael, you want to?
Nothing at this particular moment, no.
Okay. So then we can take the next question. Michael Scott is asking, I think it's a modeling question really. What is the preferred way of disambiguating language into a query like the winter example? Does the graph have multiple weights on a single edge between nodes? Would there be a separate database per entity like Nordic versus European? Or is there a logic applied to translate the question before the query is applied to the knowledge graph? I guess I'm asking, is the logic baked into the graph or does it need to be pre-processed? I certainly have an answer. Mike, what about you?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask that because I don't do anything practical, Katariina.
Michael?
I would say that's right in your sweet spot. So and because you brought it up, so I think it makes sense for you to have a crack on it.
Sure. So ultimately, and I mean, it depends to some extent on your use case, but in most of the cases, it makes sense to bake it directly into the graph. So those alternative things we were mentioning before, labels, we have the notion of an identity that would be one node, and then you can attach to it all the different labels it has in terms of languages, or then in terms of cultural context or difference. So you would basically attach multiple edges depending on what that is. And in RDF, what's really pretty about RDF is you can link to the name of your edge. So if your edge has a name, then you can attach even more information to it, being like, this is specific for this country. So let's say you have a node that represents a country, then you can even have that kind of information. So that means it is very much baked in the graph. But then pre-processing might come in because of performance reasons. So even though you have it in a graph, you might still have like a layer on top, like a cache layer, or something where you have pre-populated something, or you run an index with the help of your knowledge graph and populate that index, and that way it is pre-processed. So, but that gets into more the performance optimization part of that. Yeah, I guess I answered it for us. Then the next question. I think we're good on time, so we really have time for these questions. I'd love to take a few more, but I do have a ultimate last question to the panel as well. So, but until then, the next question from Quentin: do you see opportunities for SMEs? Somebody
Subject
help
matter
me.
expert. Subject matter expert.
Oh, subject matter expert, of course. Do you see opportunities for subject matter experts to create and digitize knowledge according to standards without the need to involve linked data experts? I'm thinking of tools such as Atkin Research, Rome Research, Notion, Obsidian.
It's a simple modeling objective, right? So what you really want to capture from an SME is what they do, what it is, and how it works. And boxes and lines are the best ways to do that. You know, capture it in a standard modeling approach of modeling their process, and then translate it into your data structures.
Yeah, and I would
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to add on to what Mike is saying. There's a few tools out there that I could even suggest to help with, yes, just do the ball and stick, do the modeling with them so they don't have to worry about it. But there are tools out there that will write the code for you underneath the model as you're going. So one I just came across recently was Graphilion, and a lot of the other graph databases like Cambridge Semantics, OntoText, they'll actually write the code for you as you're drawing the model. And that's really helpful because then it takes a lot of the legwork out of it for the knowledge engineer, because then the model that is created from the SME can then be put into action afterwards.
One thing I would say about that, for a start, I'm not familiar with those particular tools that you mentioned, Athens Research, Rome Research, etc. However, my first impression is that's kind of the holy grail. Let's be able to have SMEs just do things without requiring the technical expertise of the semantic, knowledge engineers and whatnot. And certainly there's a lot of tools coming out there that are trying to move in that direction. Reminds me a little bit of the automated creation of ontology. So you can take a huge corpus of, let's say, technical papers about maybe vaccines, just to pick a topical subject. And then you can walk over it with lots of linguistic analysis, and you can come up with a taxonomy, which is a starter kit for an ontology. And people would love to say, that's my ontology. And I have always been thinking, you could probably a good way to start off, but then to be turned into a more generically useful ontology, you need the human in the loop. So I would say these tools that are coming out there may be useful, and I would have someone look over the shoulder of an SME. So if the SME wants to have a crack at doing it without a linked data expert, I would at least have someone look over the shoulder. And the other danger with doing these things where everything is automated is it's going to result, there's a risk that it will result in semantic silos. So you build one little thing, if it's fully automated, it doesn't know what you're thinking. Really, it's trying to make a good guess. And it certainly doesn't know what the other guy in the other division or the other woman in the other division over there is thinking. So it's not going to be able to have that big picture view to make things work and to avoid the semantic silos. So I would say it's kind of a holy grail. Be careful, have a crack at it for sure, but beware of the limitations.
I think there's value in at least have it. So I was always taught that you always have two sides of the coin, right? You have the SME and the person who knows how to actually model it and get it into the systems and do all of that. So whether that's looking over the shoulder or what have you, it's really important to get that mental model. So I'm actually working on an event model right now just for fun with a friend of mine that is a pilot to see like what does an event model look like for a pilot. I have no idea how to fly a plane. That sounds cool, but I don't know how to do it. So I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to be that data therapist. And as he's talking to me, I'm going to model it out, and then I'm going to show it to him. That's how I'm going to do it. Now, and I do also prefer the, okay, draw it out for me, right? Everything can be done in an image, and that really helps everyone get on the same page, because there's so many different ways to model something. And I think that walking through that logic with the SME helps them understand your job a little bit better too.
Yep.
But this is an interesting part of building a knowledge graph that I think irks a lot of people in technology, because currently we're all talking about, well, not maybe we, but there's a lot of talk about, does it scale? Is it scalable? And what we're saying is we're actually doing a very expensive form of therapy. We're sending the data therapist to interview them, to get everyone to agree and do that marriage counseling, and then put that in the knowledge graph. So what we're ultimately saying, it's quite manual work. And I think
you're making a training set for automation, right? Like that's where the machine learning comes in, where you can actually look at the patterns. You can look at how things are being clustered together. Like if you look at social media, for instance, and you look at, one Twitter feed where people are talking about the same thing. If you mine that for what words are commonly associated with each other, you're creating a cluster of that concept. Why can't you then use that for your knowledge graph? Well, you can. So this is no different. What we're talking about, if people are drawing things on the board and not making silos, because you're at least having them all in the same room, and they're going to get it different, right? But that's where you get some of that reconciliation, and then you can learn from that and help teach machines, again, human in the loop on that, to scale it. I mean, you can't do this by hand always. If you have a small enough company, you might be able to, but it's all about taking that groundwork and then expanding on it.
Another point, I think also to understand with knowledge graph is that the size of it doesn't really give its value. So another book on my list, Michael Uschold's colleague from Semantic Arts, founder David McComb, wrote the book Data-Centric Revolution. And what I really always highlight from that book to my team is that ultimately an enterprise's vocabulary, the concepts that are understood by the enterprise, that are vital for its business, that's something that is in the hundreds, that somebody can sit down for the weekend and learn by heart over the weekend. It's not like millions of concepts, it's hundreds of concepts. So that, I think, is something to also understand when building enterprise knowledge graphs, is that you can actually do a bit of that qualitative work with a manual, and do it manually. And then if you need to use data to leverage on it to connect different data points to that one concept you have to find manually, then you use machine learning or whatever to do that leveraging with the technology.
It's a really important point, Katariina. I did some research on critical data attributes in the financial industry, and winds up being about 150. And then almost all of the 5.0 ontology probably is less than 1,000 concepts, for what everything exists into the financial. So to reinforce your point, if you do it conceptually, there is a curve that says once you reach this level, you've pretty much nailed most of the things in your organization.
So we have one more question. Let's see if we can answer this, because I think in the room we have business strategists, we have ontologists. Maybe actually you have a YouTube video even answering this question. But we have a question. We currently use knowledge graphs, but as of now, we are struggling with the scale problem. We're looking at 200 million graph updates at peak hour. Which graph database would you suggest can support this? PS, we're currently use Neptune.
So Neptune RDF or Neptune property graph?
Yes,
that's my question first.
Yes.
That's the first question. So, I mean, there is, I think it's called Gecko. maybe you guys, it's in one of my YouTube videos. I'll find it. I always think it's called Gecko, but maybe it's not called Gecko. It's a way to do performance metrics on all graph databases, on how many hops it takes to actually traverse a triple or whatever it is you're doing. And I have used that for most of the graph database selections that I've used. I will say, and I love them. I'm going to preface this by I love Pool Party. I will say that. But they don't handle that size of data, just FYI. Wonderful people if you have a smaller data set than 200 million. Some that I know work well. I mean, I'm surprised Neptune isn't working well. I can see why the performance might be not as good, because I've also seen that. But I know they're heavily investing in it, so I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they got faster than everybody else quicker. Let's see. If you're doing RDF, did the person answer? No. Oh, property graph. Oh, okay, good. That's helpful. And you all might know better than me. You all have your own experiences. Tiger graph is the fastest that I've seen at that level of scale. But Neo4j comes very, very close. Some of the other property graphs that might be interesting to look at from a size perspective, I still would say those are the top two if Neptune isn't doing it for you. And yes, I do have videos on all those.
Yes. Well, I think that's it for audience questions. We might have time for a few more. I see there's at least one we haven't answered yet at the end, but just to make sure we still have time to, and maybe it's a short answer from all of you, but my last question to the panelists is there a right or a wrong way to build an enterprise knowledge graph? And we've already touched upon that many times, but as a summary to this discussion, what is a good way and what is not a good way to build enterprise knowledge graphs? Michael, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. I'll have a crack at that. I made a list of things here. So here's the wrong way to build it. And of course, just invert it to do things the right way. So if you want to make a mess of it, don't bother thinking about use cases. Build it and think they're going to come, because they may not. Start small and be agile, but don't pay any attention to the big picture of the enterprise, because then you're going to end up with semantic silos. And similarly, don't coordinate with other divisions in the enterprise, because that's also going to result in semantic silos. Try to boil the ocean, do everything at once. Repeat the problems that have been going on for 20, 30 years. People finally gave up on building enterprise data models. They realized it was just not possible. So the question becomes, why might you build an enterprise knowledge graph or an enterprise ontology? Part of the reason is you don't have to, the nuances of every little application had its nuance. That's why data models never worked across the enterprise. But when you jump up a conceptual level, it becomes more possible. And another problem hints back at what Michael and Ashleigh were talking about, terminology. Spend all your time worrying about terminology before you get clear on what the underlying concepts are. That's going to lead you into troubles. So the flip side of that, of course, is, as Mike was emphasizing before, get really clear on what people are talking about when they use the words they use. Clarify the underlying concepts. Get really good at that. And then say, well, I've got three things here that they're different from each other, but they're closely related. Now I have to think of some good names for them, so that when people see the name, they instantly think of the right concept. So be careful about terminology and concepts. That would be my quick summary.
Want me to go next?
Mike, go ahead.
Start with modeling business value, use case tree to make sure that you are being able to measure the value of your graph against what the business problem is. Pick the right use case to start, one that's leverageable and extendable across your organization. Don't promise more than you can deliver. Focus on practical value. Be transparent. Talk the language of business when you are communicating with business. And then engineer for reusability, right? It's important to get the foundation right, because the real value of the knowledge graph is reusability. Would be my checklist.
So if I had to talk about can you do it right or wrong, let me start with that. My advice on this is the same advice that they give people that start YouTube. Just do it. You're not going to get it perfect. If you agonize over it, if you love data, your love of it is going to hinder you. And I hate to say that because I think being a data lover is one of the best gifts to be. But you have to kind of curb your enthusiasm on it so that you actually get it done, and then you can actually get it into your organization, and then you can have a whole career doing it, right? But just rip the Band-Aid off. Don't worry about people's buy-in. Don't worry about which tool you're using. Don't worry about Triple Store or Property Rack. Pick one. They almost all have open source trial runs. Just start to mess with it. And you're going to find out what works, what you need to understand better. Until you start to do that, you're going to just be stuck. So that's my number one thing, is don't overthink it in the beginning. Of course, you want to think very critically of it once you actually start to implement and do things with it. I would say the other thing is, you know, it's going back to that enthusiasm again. I made this mistake all the time when I started my career. I love this stuff. I went through blood, sweat, and tears to get a PhD on this thing. Like it's brutal, but I love it. And I think you can see that through my posture and the way that I talk about it. But I had to learn that I couldn't, my goal was not to give my passion and make sure that my stakeholders also had that passion. I made that mistake all the time in the beginning. My passion needs to help me drive the business need for if we need this, because it's not always the right choice for graph. Graph is not going to fix everything. It has to be very intentional when you do it. So that's my other piece of advice, is hold on to that passion you have, but use it when needed. And don't expect everybody else in your organization to have that same level of passion, right? And you still can have it. You're still going to be great at what you're doing, but you got to get them on board. And sometimes when you are over passionate about it, you can come off a little biased and you can come off a little less trustworthy because of it sometimes. So just be careful about that.
Yes, that's some really good advice, and I resonate with all of them. What I told my most recent team is I want to challenge them to deliver something in 6 months. Like, we need to get live with something that is driven by the KG, even if it has the tiniest bit of modeling that might be like, that's your knowledge graph, that little thing. But if it drives a real customer use case, if it is there and we've managed to develop it end to end, and then I think that is that small thing that Michael was also saying, to start small. And end to end is really important, because then you've at least walked through the whole process. And there's just it is a process. There's so many steps you need to go through. You've walked that through once, your team has learned things, and it becomes easier and easier, or at least you're more knowledgeable when you walk that path many times, hopefully in the future as well. I think these are such wonderful sentences and words to end to. It almost feels like we're like at the end of our panel discussion, but there is still a little bit of time. So I would still want to take this time to take more audience questions, because the next session is starting 15 past, and maybe want to give people, well, mostly, well, probably at their homes or at the offices, a little bit of a breather to get some water and get some coffee. So let's use the next 5 minutes to look at some more audience questions. And then I think it'll be time to wrap this panel discussion. So we have here one question from Adam. I think for us, the biggest issue with introducing a knowledge graph is governance. Today, when our subject matter experts develop our knowledge domains, they create a new version PowerPoint and add, for example, a new bullet on slide 3. When everything is interconnected, making small changes in a graph can have huge implications. What are best practices around governance for a large global enterprise?
I'm going to read that one more time, because that's an interesting question with some nuance.
I guess the thing is when they change something in a PowerPoint, it's not so dangerous. But when it's changed in a knowledge graph,
Yeah. Well, let me actually comment about that, because that does arise a lot. Change management. So what happens if you realize you got an ambiguous name for a class or a property, and you realize this is the wrong name for that class, it's the wrong name for that property, and you have to change the name. So it's easy to make the change in PowerPoint, but what about your actual system that's in production? So there's a number of steps that have to happen for something as simple as that. First of all, anyone who is using that ontology, if it's a shared ontology, they have to be notified of that change. And if they update to the new ontology, then there's a few things that they have to do. One, any data that's been created. So say there's a class called financial organization, and you decide you want to call it something slightly different. And let's just take a super silly example, car versus automobile. So you used to call things cars, and now you decide, you know what, we're going to change everything, and we're going to call them automobiles. It means the same thing. But every time you had an instance of car, it now has to be an instance of automobile instead. And all the so that's one thing you have to do. All the data and all the pipelines that you may have all around the company that use this ontology, anyone who's creating data sets of cars has to rerun their data triple creation processes to change it so it's correct. Another thing is all the applications that write queries and ask questions about cars, they can no longer have the word car as the URI in the Sparkle query. They have to change it to automobile. So you have to do all this tracking. So there's a bunch of steps that have to be taken care of, but it's doable, and you can put that stuff all into pipelines. And that's what we've been doing for a while now.
thank you.
You know, there's not a whole lot of difference between governance in a semantic environment and governance in any other environment. It all starts with the big three, right? Policy, accountability, and funding. And then you have to do the underlying prerequisites, right? You have to build your inventory, understand data flow, understand shared user agreements and service level agreements and systems of record. And once you do all that, governance in a semantic environment becomes a lot lighter touch, right? So mostly what we're doing in a conventional environment is reconciling meaning and mapping and dealing with requirement to data concepts. Once all that is done, governance in a semantic environment becomes a lot easier. And as long as it's supported by policies, Michael, I think you were kind of describing the policies you need, it becomes almost automatic.
Okay. So I think this is it. Let's give the audience 10 minutes to prepare before the next talk. And I would like to thank you so much for attending this panel discussion. Thank you, Ashleigh. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you, Katariina.
Thank you for being such a great host, Katariina.
Yeah, well done.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you. It was my first time actually hosting any of these kind of conference talks. So thank you so much. And just to give you, I think Ashleigh and I will be talking on Friday about finding community inside the knowledge graph realm, finding those people, connecting with people, but also what it means to be in this industry. So it's really a networking event. It is going to be on a slightly different platform. I think we're going to have avatars and everything's going to be more interactive than just a chat and us answering. And Mike, I'm not sure if you have still talks in this conference.
Yeah, on Friday I've done a pre-recorded talk on the business case for data management. So we'll show that video, and then I'll be available to share what I've learned in my years of data therapy.
I do not have another talk, but let me just make a quick comment. George, who organized this event, asked me if I could get a discount on my book for the people who participated. So I've just put a little announcement there. There is a code CDW2021. If you go to the website, you can get 20% off. I put something in the chat a couple.
Does that mean signed copy, Michael?
I'll sign it when you come visit me. Or if I see you at a conference, I might be in a good
I'm
chance.
going to pack my fly rod. I'm off, man. Let's go.
Are you going to Days in Austin in January? I might be there.
No.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience and for your fabulous questions. And we'll see you around I think there are going to be coffee breaks on Friday. It's going to be more interactive. We have a totally new or different platform. So see you around as much as we can in this virtual environment, and have a nice rest of the conference, everyone.
All right. See y'all.
Yeah, thanks
a lot,
everybody.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye-bye.